Hi, I'm Elliot Murphy. I'm a postdoc in the lab of Dr. Nitin Tandon in McGovern Medical School in Houston, Texas. I study the neural basis of language, in particular higher order syntax and semantics, using intracranial recordings of patients with refractory epilepsy. And today I'm going to be reviewing a bunch of experiments that we've been conducting over the last few years, trying to probe language-specific aspects of meaning, in particular contributions that language makes to human meaning that maybe some other systems like attention, visual perception maybe don't contribute. So aspects of human meaning and representation that are potentially either unique in organization and structure, or at least more kind of salient and present in everyday human interactions than might be for kind of non-linguistic faculties. So I'll be talking about, as I say, linguistic meaning in the brain. There's quite a lot of ways we can talk about meaning. We can talk about the meaning of life, the meaning of chair, the meaning of cheesecake. But I'll be talking about very basic elementary forms of meaning that enter into much more complex forms of cognition, planning, and interpretation and inference, which are essential for everyday human function, like communication and thinking and planning. But also on the surface seem quite simple, but when you get to the neural basis of these processes, the system itself becomes quite complex. A lot of meaning turns out to be linguistically structured as well, which is quite interesting. There are also forms of meaning that we can infer that are constrained by the ways that our language faculty organizes sets of words into larger structures. So for instance, I've given you the phrase here, eat cheesecake. That is a verb phrase, it's an event. There is an event of eating and the object of the event is cheesecake. Whenever two words are put together into a phrase, there seems to be an immediate sense of asymmetry. Words are not simply put together in a kind of linear, concatenated fashion. There seems to be some sense of asymmetry arising from the combination of two words. So for instance, take a very obvious example, something like blue car. When you merge the phrase blue car from the two words blue and car, you get a very simple phrase. But notice something quite interesting. A blue car is a car which is blue. It's not a blue quality that has car-related features, right? It is primarily a car, and you're simply describing it as blue. It's not as if there is a blue entity out there and you just happen to be describing it as exhibiting features that qualify it to be a car. So there seems to be a sense in which combining the word blue and car doesn't simply give you a kind of symmetric structure going on there. There seems to be a slight asymmetry. There seems to be a sense in which combining words together gives you a kind of a sense of meaning, a kind of meaning to the phrase that goes beyond the simple combination of two words. So it's not as if you simply put 2 plus 2 together and you get 4. It seems as if you put together two words that are in isolation have their own meaning, but when you put them together, it kind of yields a slightly different meaning that the two words in isolation cannot deliver. So there are forms of meaning that you can only really get if you put multiple words together. There are forms of meaning that you can only generate if you put larger structures into a kind of larger unit. So I'll be exploring 3 aspects of meaning, which due to purely an accident of human phonology, they have the same first letter, combination, concreteness, and coherence. So I'm going to be starting here with combination, putting two words together. In order to have higher order language, you need to be able to put two words together. If you can't do that, then you're really in trouble. You have to at least be able to put two words together and then add another one and another one and another one to string larger and larger sentences together to construct complex language. If you can't do that, then you really don't have language. So linguists have have identified a general trait, which is the ability to construct hierarchically organized structures in a recursive fashion of the kind I've mentioned here. Even something simple like a blue car has a kind of unique structure to it, as I mentioned. It's not simply blue plus car, it's something a little bit different. There's a kind of unique asymmetry going on here. They've also identified a possible mechanism, the mechanism being the computational procedure, what linguists call merge, which simply takes elements from the lexicon and forms a set, it forms structures. But the question of neural basis has remained quite obscure. What exactly is the brain doing when we put two things together into a larger structure? And I'm going to review some intracranial experiments that we've done that have shown that there seems to be a unique contribution to posterior superior temporal sulcus in the construction of basic phrases above and beyond the construction of lexical meaning. So a phrasal meaning is, as I've mentioned, very different from lexical meaning. So therefore, there must be some kind of brain mechanism that identifies phrasal meaning as distinct from individual word meaning. So in order to probe this, we need to kind of address some of the basic limitations of intracranial recordings. So some of the most well-known challenges and limitations of intracranial EEG is there is limited cortical coverage. There's also natural variations in anatomy and other kind of common limitations. So our lab has developed a surface-based mixed effects multi-level analysis, or SBMEMA, which yields topologically precise non-linear registration of the electrodes on the surface of individual patients, and it generates surface recording zones in standard space, and it allows you to plot higher gamma signatures across cortex in a kind of in a way that shows local cortical processing. So we're going to use that technique to tap into a very simple paradigm. We gave patients two-word phrases, and these phrases either had a pseudo word or did not have a pseudo word in them. So we gave them phrases like red car, and then the task was to look at a picture of a red car and identify whether or not the picture matched the phrase. So in this case, you can see that there was a red car and a picture of a red car, and the patients had to say yes or no. They simply pressed the button, yes or no. However, we also gave them red bulg or bulg car, where bulg is a pseudo word, with a pseudo word being a sound that obeys English phonology but just doesn't have a meaning. So it's a kind of thing that could be hypothetically a real word, but for some accident of phonology, it just happens to not have been assembled into a real word. And there's lots of pseudo words you can imagine. But we do this to probe the processing of real, genuine meaning as opposed to structures that do not have any actual lexical meaning. So our electrode coverage was pretty generous, pretty decent, as you can see in the figure in panel B. Frontotemporal coverage is quite considerable. In response to individual words, when we did a word versus pseudo word contrast, we found greater local cortical processing indexed by broadband gamma activity from 70 to 150 hertz in and around PSTS and PSTG. And you can see some exemplar traces on the right there. So that's the response to individual lexical meaning. But then once you've heard the first word, there is a sense in which the patients are going to anticipate what's coming next. So we know that when we construct individual linguistic phrases, structure is built predictably in anticipation of upcoming stimuli. And there's a lot of recent psycholinguistic work showing that these predictions are widespread across all sizes of phrases and clauses. But the question for us is, how does the brain organize neural representations to construct a noun phrase regardless of what the noun is? So the patients know they're going to hear a noun phrase. They know they're going to hear something like red boat or blue car or brown bag. But sometimes it doesn't really matter what the actual nominal is. They know that they're going to generate a structure, some kind of two-word structure. So the question for us is, can we find a signature of that anticipatory process before the onset of the second word, but after they've heard a real word? So we compared trials in which the patients had just encountered a real word, like red, and compared that to trials in which they just encountered a pseudo word. So obviously, you only anticipate a real nominal phrase if you've just heard an adjective, a real adjective, because then the patient knows that they're going to have a real phrase. Whereas if they've just heard a pseudo word, then they know that it's not going to be a meaningful phrase because it has a pseudo word in it. So we looked at lower frequency activity around the alpha and beta range, because lower frequencies seem to organize activity across larger portions of cortex than local gamma activity. So our results seem to suggest, as you can see in the figure on panel A, that portions of IFG seem to maybe provide top-down inferences about syntactic slot building. They seem to be, they show increased low frequency activity in anticipation of a real noun phrase. So it's almost as if they're potentially gearing up or getting ready and preparing a slot to be filled in order for regardless of whatever noun happens to be encountered. So with respect to actual compositional effects, we compared the responses at the second word for phrases versus non-phrases. So red boat versus the two-word phrases that contain pseudo-words. And we showed a kind of a unique signature, again indexed by broadband gamma activity, across a narrow portion of posterior superior temporal sulcus, such that very closely neighboring electrodes coded either for lexical meaning or phrasal meaning, but not both. In fact, only 3 electrodes coded for both phrasal and lexical meaning. So there's a sense in which there are electrodes in PSTS that are uniquely sensitive not just to lexical meaning, as in the meaning of red or the meaning of boat, but also to the meaning of red boat. And that's very kind of a language-specific trait. The sensitivity not just to the meaning of red or the meaning of boat, but to the meaning of red boat. And of course, indexing the sensitivity to basic phrasal meaning is the very starting point for a real neurobiological model of language. And so in fact, there is a sense in which this region that we've identified, PSTS, might actually be, you can kind of think of it as the language region. In fact, I like to think of it as the language region, because all the other things that are commonly discussed in the neurobiology of language literature indeed are pertaining to aspects of language and speech comprehension and prediction and lexical access and so on. But really the core of language, when you think about it, the core of language is really this ability to put two things together into a larger structure. And so this region seems to be uniquely sensitive to that. In addition, the 2 regions that I've already mentioned, PSTS and IFG, showed significant functional connectivity during phrase composition relative to non-phrase composition. So you can see in the panel C at the bottom there that the sites in PSTS, the electrodes that were sensitive to composition, or they did show greater BGA responses to phrases, those were the electrodes that showed increased functional connectivity with IFG, and not the other PSTS electrodes that did not show effects of composition. So there is a potential sense in which PSTS is potentially generating the structure that is being inferred by the 2 words, and then either shipping it off to an interpretation memory control system in IFG, or potentially contra-directionally, there is a potential for top-down inferences, again, predictively, as I mentioned earlier, being generated by IFG. So regardless of the story that you potentially ground this in, PSTS and IFG seem to be communicating in crucial respects to generate basic phrases. Lastly, one final slide here on this experiment. We compared the responses to when patients saw a picture that matched the phrase they heard, and compared that to when we showed them a picture of an object which did not match the phrase that they'd heard. And just quickly to note here, because this is not too particularly relevant to the main thrust of the talk, is that we found anterior insular responses that were greater for phrase picture matches relative to phrase picture contrasts. Now, moving on to the second topic, concreteness. The negotiation of concrete and abstract concepts is a really fundamental component of everyday life. And in fact, if you just think about random sentences that you speak on the daily basis, it will almost definitely have a very broad mixture of concrete and abstract concepts. It's unavoidable that you have that. And in fact, even supposedly concrete concepts are imbued with an intermixture of abstract meaning that seems just as essential to the object's identity as the concrete aspect itself. So think of something like lunch. You can say lunch was delicious but delayed. In that sense, lunch is an event, but it's also a physical object, right? Lunch can be 3 hours, 2 hours, 1 hour, but it could also be tasty or horrific. Same for things like book. You can describe a book as being interesting, but also heavy. You can describe a book as being sad, but also hardback or paperback. So even these very supposedly concrete concepts are imbued with abstract meaning. And the question for us is, how does the brain negotiate this task of representing concrete and abstract concepts independently? So there's a generalization from the neuroimaging literature that there is greater engagement for verbal systems for abstract words than for concrete words. But nevertheless, the neurorepresentation of concrete and abstract words remains far from resolved. Abstract words, just for a quick consultation, abstract words include words like time, yesterday, and justice, whereas concrete words, of course, can be perceived through the five senses, so things like things that you can touch, smell, taste, and so on, like table, phone, and laptop. So abstract words are thought to rely on language cortex much more so than concrete concepts. So we gave patients an RSVP task with orthographic stimuli, showing them words 1 second per word, either concrete words or abstract words, or also mid-scale words, which I'm not going to talk about today, but mid-scale words are kind of interesting. They're words like magic that have a mixture of both concrete and abstract meaning. All items were controlled for AOA, dip frequency, length, and so on. And the task was for the patients to simply identify the concreteness. So is this word something that you can touch, smell, or taste? So these results are quite preliminary. We only have about 12 or 13 patients, I believe, who've done this task. But generally, we found greater broadband gamma activity in ventral temporal surface, where the red indicates greater 70 to 150 hertz power during the interpretation of concrete words than for abstract words. And there is some preliminary evidence that portions of IFS or IFG responded greater for abstract words, again, subserving language cortices. Moving beyond this, we also have conducted a number of stimulation sessions in which we took the true positives during the ECOG task, and a few days later we came back to the AMU and we asked the patients to do the task again, and we stimulated during 50% of the trials to see if this causally disrupted the patient's performance. So for this particular site in here, this patient had right-sided coverage. There was electrode MST 6 and 7, which during clinical stimulation showed narrative reading difficulties. And the ECOG response for this site also showed greater BGA for concrete words. So without stimulation, in other words, just during the task, the patient scored very well indeed, but an average of about 91.5% accuracy. But then during stimulation, the patient performance dropped considerably, and they performed at chance for concrete words, but not for abstract words. Another patient also, same story, but interestingly, this electrode showed greater BGA responses for abstract words, but not for concrete words. But concreteness itself, the ability to make that judgment, was also knocked out. So this site was also causally attributed to concreteness ratings. And then lastly, another site here where the patient performed 100% accuracy without for abstract words, but then for stimulation, they performed at chance for concrete words. Lastly, I'm going to talk about coherence. So I've talked about combination, putting two words together. I've talked about concrete versus abstract words and how they're represented. And the final topic is going to be about more of the use of these larger structures to generate a general coherent or incoherent sentence meaning. So I've mentioned putting two words together, but what about putting sentences together, right? Sentences are often much more common in everyday conversation than two-word phrases. We don't usually communicate simply using two-word phrases. We usually use multiple words. But what happens when you're constructing a sentence and the meaning of the sentence is suddenly disrupted to yield a completely incongruent meaning? So for instance, a coherent sentence would be something like, John ate the delicious cheesecake, but an incoherent sentence would be, John ate the delicious weekend, where there's a kind of category error there, where it's simply a meaningless sentence. So again, on this theme, the fundamentally creative and generative nature of language allows us to refer to a known entity using phrases we've never encountered. So we know what a banana is, but we may have never heard it described as an elongated yellow fruit. So the question is, how does the brain make the inference that we're talking about a very common object using a collection of words that we've never heard before? I've never heard of the phrase an elongated yellow fruit before, but I know what it means. It means a banana. So we, again, using intracranial recordings, we probed this task using a naming to definition task, where we gave patients sentences like, in RSVP style, a round red fruit in panel C there, versus a round red age. And the task of the patient was to define the provide the answer to the definition. So the definition around red fruit, they'd say something like apple or strawberry or something, or cherry or something like that. But around red age, they would be asked to say nonsense. This is 57 patients. This is quite a few years of research by now. Very generous frontoparietal and temporal, ventral and medial temporal coverage. And so what we did is we plotted the activation, again in looking at BGA, broadband gamma activity, across the parsing of the sentence from word 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And you see activation in IFS, ventral temporal cortex, ATL. Just for this is purely the activation to sentence comprehension, regardless of referential versus non-referential, whether or not the sentence was congruent or not. But then when we analyzed the contrast at the final word, so the congruent versus incongruent marker was always the final word in the sentence. When we analyzed at the point of the final word, we see some quite interesting responses. So the red coloration here indexes greater BGA for meaningful, kind of congruent and referential sentences, so sentences that refer to something, like a person at the circus who makes you laugh. That's obviously referring to a clown. In contrast to the non-referential sentence, a person at the circus who makes you commute, which of course doesn't refer to anything. We found greater engagement in medial parietal cortex, hippocampus, and inferior frontal sulcus for the recruitment to generate the inference of a meaningful sentence structure. These regions are much easier to access using intracranial recordings, in particular IFS over IFG. IFG is often implicated a lot in higher order sentence processing in the extracranial world. But using intracranial recordings, we can show that IFS in particular seems to be more engaged than IFG in this semantic task. And of course, tracking direct recordings from medial parietal cortex is very difficult indeed using, say MEG. IEEG is really the only way that you can probe this activity. So this is just plotting the traces for MPC electrodes. You can see that the effect begins around 250 milliseconds and lasts until just before the point of articulation. And I've also plotted on the bottom right of the figure, you can see the traces for before the onset of the final word and also during patient articulation. So the effect does seem to be a uniquely semantic effect. It seems to be an effect driven by meaning and not driven by articulation, planning, or pre-final word differences, even though of course they're the same sentence, just to kind of validate this effect. So the effect in NPC and IFS seems to be, as I mentioned, a meaningful effect of meaning. We also plot the differences between left and right hemisphere here, just to show that the effect is indeed specific to language dominant left hemisphere, and it's not an effect of right hemisphere. So we also showed this effect in VMPFC, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which has also been implicated in the last 5 or 6 years in forms of higher order combination and coherence. So we showed that here, again, a slightly later effect. The effect arises around 800 milliseconds for VMPFC, so quite later than for hippocampus, IFS, and MPC, but nevertheless the effect is there. And you can think of all sorts of potential explanations for why the effect is later there. But again, it seems to be unique to language dominant hemisphere. This is plotting the effects in hippocampus. So we took the electrodes that were placed directly solely within hippocampus proper and the electrodes that were placed in neighboring parahippocampal gyrus using the Human Connectome Project parcellation map. And we plot here the traces for hippocampal theta power and contrast it with parahippocampal gyrus BGA responses. And you can see that there's a kind of a nice pickup effect where you have early, roughly N400 windowy effects in hippocampal theta being immediately followed by parahippocampal gyrus BGA effects. And as you can see from the spectrograms, the effect is extremely clear, both for low frequencies in hippocampus and in higher frequencies for parahippocampal gyrus. I've plotted a couple of exemplar electrodes in panel B, and then in panel C, we again looked at functional connectivity between our regions of interest, and we show that between MPC and hippocampus, the functional connectivity between these two regions for sentences that were meaningless or incongruent actually dropped. There was a significant dropout in connectivity during the meaningless sentences. So the effect seems to be present not simply in the local responses in these discrete regions of interest, but it also seems to be reflected in the communication, the interareal communication between the regions that we've identified as being sensitive to these aspects of higher order linguistic meaning. And then we also did a separate analysis where we took all of the sentences that were meaningless. So I mentioned the example earlier, a person at the circus who makes you commute. Now that's obviously a non-referential sentence, but it's still kind of meaningful, right? There could be a person at the circus who makes you commute, right? It's possible. There just doesn't happen to be. But a bunch of our sentences were either meaningful in that sense, meaningless, sorry, in that sense, with a kind of what we call a weak violation. So a weak violation in our terms simply means that it's a coherent semantic concept. You can construct the concept. It just doesn't happen to refer to any human being. On the other hand, we have sentences in our stimuli set, like a place where oceans shop, where there's a real semantic kind of category error. You know, it's like trying to describe a tiger as a financial institution. It's just a completely meaningless. Whereas the clown example is non-referential. It doesn't refer, but it's still meaningful. You can construct a meaningful English sentence. So what we did is we contrasted the weak with the strong violation non-coherent sentences, and we plot the responses here, again looking at BJ, and there was a pretty clear effect in pars triangularis and middle temporal gyrus for weak as opposed to strong violations. So in other words, where there was semantic coherence, then you find greater BJ in IFG and MTG. Now what's interesting about this analysis is that both of the sentences that we contrasted in this analysis were non-referential. They didn't actually successfully define anything, right? They were completely non-defining sentences, but half of the sentences were kind of semantically coherent and the other half were semantically incoherent. So this is a nice way of kind of tapping into pure language-specific semantic coherence independent of the task. So this is not related, of course, to success versus unsuccessful, because both of these sentences were unsuccessful in the task, right? Neither of the sentences referred. And then we also did a separate analysis where we looked at the point of the sentence in which the answer became obvious. So for some sentences, the answer was not obvious until the final word, but then other sentences, the answer was obvious by about halfway through the sentence. And again, we kind of showed that the regions that were sensitive, the regions that had to do more work at the final word, so the limited narrowing sentences, also overlapped with the areas we found for the coherent versus incoherent analysis. So MPC and IFS and so on. So it seems as if this process, this kind of narrowing process of narrowing down the set of possible answers, the kind of, you know, reducing the hypothesis space, seems to be coded by the same regions. Again, isolating one of the regions from this area was PSTS. So PSTS uniquely responded for the narrowing analysis that I just showed you on the last slide, but it wasn't, if you recall, it also wasn't responsive to the broader referential versus non-referential analysis. So what's going on here? Well, this seems to suggest that PSTS, as I showed at the beginning of this talk, when I talked about combination, PSTS seems to code for semantic integration. It cares about integrating different aspects of linguistic meaning, but it doesn't care too much about things like coherence, which are subserved by frontal and parietal regions. And you can see exemplar traces here where there's no effect of referential versus non-referential. The PSTS doesn't care if the sentence is defining an object or not, but it does care if the sentence is reducing the hypothesis space, so integrating semantic information in a meaningful way. So finally, just to kind of generate a very specific model for this, this model for linguistic reference was derived purely from our own experiment here. So I'm putting aside all the other regions that we know and care about, like mid-fusiform gyrus and ATL, and I've just focused on the regions that we can motivate using this particular analysis. So you can see that MPC, IFS, and VMPFC care about reference and inferential memory and attention and so on, whereas the regions that care about types, so semantic types, are subserved by lateral, temporal, and frontal areas. This follows a kind of standard model in semantics, defining linguistic meaning in terms of types, individual tokens, so multiple copies of types, and then the actual referent. So again, just to summarize, combination seems to be subserved by a mosaic-like response in PSTS, concreteness by medial frontal temporal, and coherence by this network that I've just shown of parietal, IFS, and hippocampus. And these independent directions for exploring language reveal how the brain processes some of the most crucial aspects of meaning necessary for wordly engagements. And I'd like to thank you for listening, and thank you for my fellow lab members.